November 1, 1944, Saipan before dawn. The airfield is a hard strip of coral and steel, edged by jungle that still holds the night's damp breath. The Pacific lies beyond the runway like a sheet of black glass. In the darkness, ground crews move with practiced urgency beneath the hulking silhouette of an F-13, an unarmed photographic reconnaissance variant of the B-29 Superfortress. Its metal skin is cool to the touch, beaded with salt moisture, and its four engines, when they catch, do not roar so much as announce a new kind of certainty, steady, mechanical, and almost indifferent. The aircraft begins its long roll. The propellers churn the air into a vibration you feel in your ribs. Then the wheels lift, and the great bomber climbs out over the ocean, rising into the pale edge of morning like a slow, deliberate promise. Hours later, far to the northwest, Tokyo is bright with midday sunlight and routine. Streetcars rattle, chimneys breathe smoke. The city, though strained by war, still lives with the assumption that distance and sky are protective barriers. People have heard rumors of American aircraft, whispers from the perimeter of the empire. But the capital remains, in the public imagination, the guarded heart of a nation. Then a sound arrives, thin, distant, high. Not the frantic rasp of fighters in a low duel, but something calmer, heavier. A tone that does not hurry. At 32,000 feet, Captain Ralph D. Stakely's F-13 passes over Tokyo and surrounding industrial areas in clear weather, and begins to photograph Japan's war machine from above. The mission returns with roughly 7,000 photographs, an intelligence harvest that will help plan the raids that are coming. Source: Tokyo looks up, and for a moment the war becomes visible in a new way. Not as ships burning on distant seas, not as soldiers dying in jungles, but as an enemy presence calmly occupying the air over the imperial capital. This is where the title's truth lives, because what stunned Japanese pilots was not simply that American bombers were present. It was that they were present in a layer of sky where effort no longer guaranteed contact, and courage no longer guaranteed reach. Japan's defenders respond. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service's 47th Sentai, tasked with providing cover over Tokyo, scrambles Nakajima Kai-44 fighters to intercept. They begin taking off around 1 p.m., but the Kai-44, fast and aggressive at lower altitudes, was not designed for easy life in thin air. As they climb, oxygen thins, temperatures plunge, and engines strain for performance they were never meant to sustain so high for so long. Source: from the ground it might look like defense in motion. Fighters ascending, anti-aircraft guns angling upward, search crews scanning the sky. But from the cockpit of an interceptor climbing toward 32,000 feet, the experience is different. The enemy is visible, sometimes only a glint, sometimes a silver cross against blue, but the distance refuses to close. The climb becomes a slow surrender of speed. The aircraft grows heavy. The controls feel thick. Every meter upward is purchased with a loss of energy that cannot be recovered. The record is blunt. The Japanese pilots could not get closer than about 3,000 feet from Stakely's aircraft. They fired machine guns but did not hit. Anti-aircraft batteries also fired without success. The reason is as humiliating as it is simple. The available fighter aircraft and guns could not reach the high altitude at which it operated. Source: that sentence carries a weight beyond the mission. It is the sound of a ceiling lowering over a nation's confidence. Because Japan had entered the war with a belief system, one cultivated by early victories and reinforced by propaganda, that the homeland was protected by more than geography. It was protected by spirit, by discipline, by sacrifice. In the air, Japanese pilots had been taught that audacity and skill could overcome technical disadvantages. The image of the fighter pilot, sharp-eyed, aggressive, fearless, was a cornerstone of wartime pride. But high altitude is not impressed by pride. Thin air does not care about ideology. At 32,000 feet, the war becomes mathematics: horsepower, climb rate, oxygen, temperature, and the steady advantage of a machine designed to live where others merely visit. The B-29 Superfortress was built for that environment. It introduced technologies that were rare in wartime bomb system that could direct remote turrets by analog computing. Its wartime operating ceiling is recorded at about 31,850 feet, and sources note this was among its best defenses, because Japanese fighters could barely reach that altitude, and few could catch the B-29 even if they did. Zors. So the shock Japanese pilots felt was not only tactical, it was existential. They were confronting an enemy that had turned the sky into a kind of industrial territory, one where advantage could be manufactured and repeated. And as the F-13 continues its passes, another surprise reveals itself, not for Japan, but for America. Stakely reports unusually strong winds over Tokyo, with ground speed sometimes only about 70 miles per hour. The jet stream over Japan was not yet well understood by the USAAF at the time. It would later complicate high-altitude bombing operations in ways that undermined the very doctrine the B-29 had been designed to fulfill. Zors. This is the cruel symmetry of air war. The same altitude that protects you from fighters can expose you to winds that steal your accuracy. But for the Japanese pilots climbing and failing beneath the reconnaissance plane, the immediate lesson is simpler. The enemy can come, and you may not be able to touch him. The F-13 returns to Saipan after a 14-hour flight, and the crew names the aircraft Tokyo Rose, a sardonic nod to propaganda broadcasts that tried to shape the war's story with words. Stakely receives the Distinguished Flying Cross. The photos take weeks to process and months to analyze. Source. And in those months, the why of the mission becomes clear, because this sortie is not merely a flight. It is reconnaissance in the most strategic sense. It is the preface to a campaign. By late 1944, the 20th Air Force's XXI Bomber Command is preparing to conduct sustained bombing of the Japanese home islands from newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands. Those bases, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, are positioned so that Tokyo is roughly 1,500 miles away, inside the B-29's operational reach. Source. This is where history turns from possibility to inevitability. Japan's leaders knew, in theory, that American industrial capacity was vast. They had watched the United States mobilize after Pearl Harbor, but war has a way of keeping truths abstract until they appear physically overhead. Until that point, the Japanese public could still imagine the conflict as something happening outward, on islands and seas. But now the sky above Tokyo has been occupied, photographed, measured, and calmly departed. The air war is no longer at the edges. A later Air Force retrospective describing the opening of the Marianas B-29 campaign captured the psychological effect. The appearance of superfortresses over Tokyo brought home the stark reality that American air power was within reach of the home islands, and that the Japanese Air Force couldn't do a thing about it. Zors. That is the emotional core of this story, helplessness in the face of reach. Yet this helplessness did not mean Japan did nothing. It meant Japan's air defense was forced into desperate adaptation. Interceptors were scrambled again and again. Pilots climbed until their aircraft felt like dying birds. Some units resorted to head-on attacks, ramming tactics, or heavy cannon modifications later in the campaign. But early on, particularly when B-29s operated near their ceiling, the defense existed in a narrow band where success required perfect conditions and often cost the pilot everything. To understand why this stunned Japanese pilots, consider the difference between seeing and reaching. A pilot can see an aircraft above him and still be powerless. The gap between 29,000 and 32,000 feet is not just distance. It is temperature, oxygen deprivation, engine performance limits, and the slow erosion of airspeed that makes interception impossible. In that realm, the bomber does not need to dogfight. It only needs to maintain altitude, formation discipline, and speed. And the B-29 could do that when the weather allowed it. The aircraft itself was a symbol of American abundance, but the most haunting symbol for those beneath it was not its size. It was the sound. A recurring sound, the distant, steady engine note from above. Not a scream, not a dive, not the snarl of combat at close range. This sound was detached from fear. It was procedural. It suggested repetition. It suggested that the aircraft above Tokyo was not a lone miracle, but the forward edge of a system that could send more and more and more. That sound carried ideology without words, because a dictatorship often relies on controlling what its people can imagine. It can hide bad news, censor losses, reshape reality through propaganda. But a sound in the sky cannot be edited out of the air. An aircraft that cannot be shot down cannot be denied. And when civilians see fighters rise and fail, they witness something worse than destruction: impotence. The Tokyo overflight was seen by many Japanese civilians, and the failure to destroy the intruder increased concerns about the course of the war. Source: this mattered because morale is not merely emotion, it is capacity. It determines how long a society can tolerate rationing, grief, exhaustion, and fear. When morale cracks, production falters, absenteeism rises, anger finds new targets. Later in the campaign, American analyses would note that the B-29 raids brought home to the Japanese people that geographic remoteness did not protect a nation from modern air war, and that the conviction spread that continued resistance was futile as bombing extended to more cities. Zors. But in November 1944, the transformation begins with a single experience. A pilot climbs, sees the enemy and cannot close. A gun crew fires, watches shells burst far below the bomber's path. A civilian watches the sky and realizes that the capital can be overflown. The next phase arrives quickly. On November 24, 1944, B-29s strike Japan from the Marianas. One of the first times in history, a transoceanic bombing raid is conducted on that scale, and the first major appearance of American bomber formations over Tokyo since the Doolittle raid in 1942. Zors. In principle, these early attacks follow American doctrine: high-altitude, daylight, precision bombing. The B-29 is supposed to fly high, bomb accurately, and avoid interception. In practice, Japan's atmosphere fights back. The jet stream, those fierce winds above Japan, turns the bombing problem into a moving target. Cloud layers obscure aimpoints. Fuel is consumed faster than predicted. Bomb loads are limited. The early months are described as a period of trial and error, with unfavorable results from high-altitude tactics over Japan. Source: and this is where the story becomes more than a... Because the B-29's altitude did not automatically guarantee decisive results. It guaranteed survivability more than accuracy. It allowed the Americans to persist in the face of defenses. But persistence alone does not win, effect does. So the Americans adapted. General Curtis LeMay takes command in January 1945. He concludes that the problem is not merely crews or courage but method. High-altitude daylight tactics are not producing the desired results, and the jet stream undermines precision. Source: what follows is one of the most significant tactical transformations of the Pacific Air War. The shift to low-altitude night incendiary bombing, designed to evade high-altitude winds and exploit the vulnerability of Japanese urban construction. Source: but even that later transformation does not erase what Japanese pilots felt earlier when the bombers climbed beyond reach. In fact, it deepens it, because the message becomes layered. At high altitude, you cannot reach us. At low altitude, you cannot stop enough of us. The B-29 becomes, in Japanese perception, not simply an aircraft but a relentless instrument that can choose its manner of attack based on what works best, and can change tactics faster than Japan can build an answer. This is what industrial democracy looks like when it goes to war. Not perfection, but adaptation at scale. And the symbolic sound returns. At 32,000 feet, it is the distant engine note above Tokyo, calm, unreachable. At 7,000 feet, it becomes a heavier roar over a burning city. At sea level, it becomes the rumble of factories producing replacement parts, fuel, and airframes across an ocean. The sound is not only aircraft, it is capacity. The National WWII Museum's account of Operation Meeting House, the Tokyo firebombing raid of March 9-10, 1945, describes B-29s marking targets, laying incendiaries, and the city becoming a funeral pyre, with fires so bright a crewman could almost read a paper in the cockpit. It emphasizes the jet stream's impact on earlier high-altitude raids and LeMay's shift to low-altitude night tactics. Source: and an Air Force historical analysis underscores the broader moral and psychological effect. Once raids increased, propagandists could not hide reality. People grew more outspoken in criticism. The conviction spread that continued resistance was futile, and the Japanese increasingly realized there was no defense against the B-29. Source: but let us return to the pilots. Imagine the physical reality of a high-altitude intercept attempt in late 1944. A Japanese pilot climbs in pursuit. The cockpit grows colder. The engine's response becomes sluggish. The sky darkens slightly at the edges, not from weather but from altitude's thinness. The bomber remains above level stable. It does not turn to fight. It does not need to. It is protected by height and by the fact that time is on its side. Every minute the interceptor spends climbing is fuel burned, engine stressed, oxygen depleted. The interceptor arrives near the ceiling exhausted, with little speed advantage left to close the distance. The bomber, meanwhile, continues forward, pressurized compartments keeping American crew alive and functional where the interceptor pilot is fighting the air itself. Because Japan's wartime ideology insisted on the power of will, it taught that hardship purified. That sacrifice was proof of superiority. But the B-29's high-altitude presence suggested a different philosophy, that a nation's strength could be organized into machines that reduce the need for sacrifice by making the fight asymmetrical. The Americans were not immune to sacrifice, far from it. But the B-29 represented an effort to apply science, manufacturing, and logistics to compress risk and extend reach. The aircraft itself was the product of enormous investment and production, nearly 4,000 built, and included advanced systems for its time. Source: so the Japanese pilots' shock was partly humiliation and partly recognition. They were confronting not only enemy pilots but enemy civilization expressed as altitude. And that recognition changed perception. It could not be undone by propaganda alone. In the months after the reconnaissance sortie, as more B-29s arrive, the air war intensifies. The B-29 offensive expands, growing into an armada that shifts from limited operations to sustained pressure. The Air Force retrospective notes the growth from a single wing to multiple wings and hundreds, then 1,000 B-29s, underscoring how quickly American air power scaled. Source: Japan, already stretched by losses at sea and the tightening blockade, must now fight a war on a new front. The vertical front, where every mile upward feels like a dwindling supply of hope. And then, as tactics evolve, the war turns from the problem of reach to the problem of endurance. Because Japan could sometimes reach B-29s, it could sometimes damage them, it could sometimes kill crews. But it could not build a defense system that reliably stopped it. That is the transformation at the heart of this story, the shift from a belief in defense to the experience of vulnerability. Epilogue: quiet, poetic, and anchored in a larger truth. The leaders of nations often speak of distance as protection. Oceans become moats, mountains become walls, skies become sacred space, and for centuries those assumptions held. But on November 1, 1944, over Tokyo, a single aircraft carried a different lesson into the clear air above Japan. It taught that the sky is not owned by tradition. It is owned by whoever can reach it, hold it, and return again. It taught that modern power is not only bravery. It is production, organization, adaptation, and the ability to place steel and fuel and training into motion at scales an enemy cannot match. And it taught something about democracy's darker strength in total war, that when an industrial society mobilizes, it can create not just weapons, but inevitabilities, engine notes that arrive from beyond reach, again and again, until even the most controlled narratives cannot silence what the people have heard with their own ears. The sound over Tokyo was not only an aircraft. It was a warning that freedom and ideology are not fought only in speeches and slogans, but in the unseen machinery of capacity, where a nation either rises to meet the future or watches it pass overhead, unreachable. Visual references you can